slide. So Brian, you want to introduce yourself? You work at Blumira as well, and one of our security researchers, right?
Yeah, I'm on the detection engineering side of the house here. So I create the detections to hopefully prevent and detect your ransomware scenario here so that you can stop it before it gets to that ransom stage, which is kind of the real focus that I tend to key in on. Is that it's no luck if the thing that lets you know you've been ransomware is the ransom note. You gotta see what's happening beforehand.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the key things you mentioned there is the fact that cryptocurrencies have enabled the possibility of this world of having ransomware, right? And so I think, first off, as we've seen rise in these attacks, like there's not necessarily a specific target, I think, in mind. It's more or less a low-hanging fruit type exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of who can you find to deploy it to, so then you can try and extort and get a ransom out of them, correct?
Very much so. Yep. As a criminal actor, you're looking to monetize your access, and that's really the thing that the cryptocurrency has allowed: the easy flow of money between the attacker and attacked. And yeah, so if you have access, look to monetize it is kind of where a lot of these actors are coming from.
And I think one thing that's changed as well is, like, not only now are they deploying disk encryption, right? They're also using other tactics like exfiltrating the data. Is that right?
Yep, that's been a big change in the last year with several of the most prominent groups essentially pulling a double, thing where they both encrypt the data and then, threaten to leak it as either to get you to pay an additional fee or as a way to, even if you have backups, right? Like, oh, you have backups, but you're not safe because we have your data as well and we'll leak it. So you have to pay us anyways, right? So like it's kind of ensuring on their end more leverage to put on, that attacked, entity to get that money out.
And you mentioned some things around regulation coming in the crypto space around helping this area. I kind of jokingly said, hey, the last week, I think we read regulations saying they're going to put a committee together to talk about cryptocurrency for the next year. And I was like, that's a great way to kick the can down. But it sounds like there's some things you've gotten visibility on that they're working on doing regulation-wise against, you said, terrorism and extortion. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that is probably the most likely to come up soon is certain know your customer requirements and some of the federal laws that were passed around terrorism funding, back 20 years ago or whatever. As traditional banks already have these requirements, and a lot of those same requirements would certainly enable law enforcement to better act against, the actors, that are abusing the, ease of access of all the cryptocurrency exchanges out there.
Yeah. How does that work with DeFi? Oh, sorry. Bad comment. Let's not go down a rat hole. But yeah, DeFi is decentralized exchanges. That's why I asked. But let's focus more on ransomware. And so, if you look at a ransomware attack, I think there's certainly a few different places and activities that happen before disk encryption happens on a host or on storage arrays or even via the data exfiltration side of things. So, I think the important thing here is kind of walking through what are some things to look for from an early indication, and starting from discovery to gaining a foothold, escalating privileged access, executing files, exfiltrating data, and then actual deployment of ransomware. So let's start off with discovery, right? What are people looking for? How are they looking for these things today?
Sure. So when it comes to discovery on the ransomware actor side, you do have some stuff that would be considered external access. And those are going to be things like exposed RDP servers, VPN, firewall appliances. And really what they're looking for there, is like you say, that low hanging fruit. So if you have RDP exposed, you're going to expect that, there's going to be a lot of brute forcing attempts. And sometimes you get a really unskilled actor who might get in, they might encrypt one system. But some of the more capable groups also still are using brute force RDP access. And those would be the ones that you would expect to then pivot throughout your environment until they can become domain admin, which the second part of that is don't just have to think of discovery as when they're outside the network looking at you, but one of the key areas that we really key into is actually the discovery they have to do once they're inside. So if they say come in through RDP, there's a detection opportunity, but once they're in, if they want to pivot through their environment, they have to do that discovery all over again, right? They have to see what systems are around them. They have to see if they're in an Active Directory, who are the domain admins that I need to target, and where are those domain admins? Where are the network file shares? So that's the next step you can really talk about when it comes to discovery, because once they're in, if they're one of the capable crews, that's their next step, is they always want to then pivot, move laterally, and that requires a second round of discovery there. But alternatively, the other one that's been really big in the last couple months has been those unpatched network edge devices. So things like your FortiGates and Sonic walls. So definitely making sure that you're keeping those things patched is something that you can also do because they're looking for the unpatched ones, right?
Yep. I'm not in shock at all, because I think I understand a good sense of the world. But yeah, I think initially it surprised me every time we deploy Blumira and someone's like, oh, we don't have any RDP on the internet. Essentially we detect, one of the ways we detect some of the infiltration or getting in is essentially, hey, someone's connecting via an external IP address over an RDP session. And I gotta say, like, out of the number of times I've deployed, it seems like a 30 to 50% hit rate where they have RDP exposed, and either they didn't know RDP shouldn't be exposed, and/or they did it a long time ago and forgot. Those are the three categories of like the surprise response you get when someone sees that happening within their environment. So taking a step down, right? Once I actually do and get some discovery, and I think both internally and externally are different viewpoints to look at here. And I think on the discovery side, like there's tools where you could look externally in, like Shodan or Census. There's ways to monitor, like with Blumira, of, hey, are these things happening through logging and other behaviors. And then also honeypots are a good example of ways to detect that lateral movement of people trying to move around. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but really, then we move on to, hey, how do I actually gain a foothold, and what types of tactics are people using during a ransomware attack there that can be caught early in a staged attack?
Right, exactly. Yeah, we've already covered a lot of what we have on the slide here, but that's really only kind of about half the ransomware space, because the other half, when it comes to gaining a foothold, is the big commodity botnets out there. The trick bots, Iced ID, Qbot. Those tend to be the next most prominent way that the actors gain their foothold. The real big one last year was Emotet, but luckily the feds, along with some international law enforcement, took that down earlier this year. But yeah, being able to detect, like if an employee receives a Word document, and that Word document then all of a sudden spawns PowerShell, that's still to this day one of the most common ways that those commodity botnets get that initial access there.
No, that's I think it's helpful to be able to look for behavior and service around that. And then taking a little bit further, so like once I gain a foothold, I think a lot of times people are running, and this might be in like a little bit different category, it might be number 3, But I think of the examples of Cobalt Strike, Mimikatz, and my understanding is those basically are taking advantage of known vulnerabilities and outdated software. Is that right? Or am I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, Mimikatz will take advantage of some things that are out of date, but even a fully patched system can be affected with Mimikatz. And same thing with Cobalt Strike is they're really leveraging a lot of the features of Windows, in addition to the possibility of actual exploits there. But yeah, as far as escalating privilege, that is exactly what you would expect. Again, if you're talking about the more experienced crews, Cobalt Strike is their favorite platform. It's widely available, to legitimate, security professionals, but cracked versions of it have been traded in the the underground scene for quite some time now, and so it is, at least in my experience, probably utilized in upwards of 70% of all the ransomware attacks that I've worked with. And yeah, gaining that next step in the privilege escalation, Mimikatz is a traditional way of doing that. Things like pass the hash and overpass the hash, which are other things that we definitely look for when it comes to unusual activity within your environment. Those are things that would definitely be red flags for a ransomware actor, looking to make that step just before they move laterally.
Yep. And then once they then get that access, one of the things I think that they're doing a lot of times is executing files, malicious code, to I guess further expand that foothold. Is that right? From an approach?
Yeah. So once you have that first, endpoint, whether say you came in through RDP or through, that phishing email, and you've, gained yourself, an escalated privilege, like perhaps your local admin, and your organization unfortunately uses the same local admin across all the machines. It's actually a pretty common configuration, unfortunately. Well, then, yes, the adversary now needs to execute their software on each of those other systems to begin to move to where they can have access to everything, right? And so that one Cobalt Strike now needs to become 2, 3, 4, 5 Cobalt Strikes, and they may choose to do that via transferring files over SMB and then executing those, or PowerShell, right? PowerShell or Windows Remote Management. They'll use those different built-in tools to be able to then leverage, new Cobalt Strike connections on each of those machines that they then want to pivot to as they further get escalated access to the environment.
Hey, and from your experience on these types of ransomware attacks, how much time is going on between these activities and up until when ransomware is actually getting deployed?
It can be scarily fast. I have seen all of it happen in under a day, from when that initial, RDP access or, that initial phishing email, executed that, first, botnet malware, as little as a day to, become domain admin and encrypt the entire network. There are public reports, where, it said, oh, they've been in here for months or, whatever. I think earlier on, going back to like, 2018, time frame, I think that was more common, but, it's been years, right? And some of these groups have been doing the same activity, and like anyone with practice, you get better at it. So I do think that a lot of the groups now, you're talking about days as your time window, as opposed to, a few years ago where it was, weeks or months.
Yep. No, I would agree with that, and I think that's it's getting visibility into these early indicators that give you a chance, because by the time they're at the late stage, right, it's pretty much game over, and then it's, hey, hopefully we have some good backups and they work. So yeah, let's talk about
assuming they don't do this though, right?
Well, yes. So data exfiltration side of things, like this has been changing rapidly in the ransomware game, more recently. And I think it's quite interesting. I think I kind of look at DeFi and see like actually there could be an opportunity of markets similar, probably that already exists that I just don't know about. But on the data exfiltration side, like what are you seeing there, and what types of things are adversaries doing in this regard?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing here is when you do see data exfiltration occur, it's usually being done by, legitimate stuff. So they're usually not using malware to do the exfiltration part. Usually once they've gotten to this point, they have enough legitimate credentials in the environment that whatever activity they're going to be doing is going to be done as a, authenticated user. And they're going to take advantage of either tools that they're familiar with or tools that are in the environment. So things like rclone to run syncs, or FTP, just straight up, dropping FileZilla and making an FTP connection out. And these are things that you can definitely pick up on. And generally, what they're looking for is large troves of data. So not so much like the individual workstations, but they're looking for your file shares, right? Where you have, vast amounts of data stored. So they're going to attempt to zip that up somewhere and then use one of those utilities to start pushing it out to their external access point.
Sweet. That's, I mean, so it looks like there's a lot of different things you can look at from hey, is exfiltrating data happening? I think the other thing too is people overlook a lot of times like the ways data can be exfiltrated, right? Whether it's forwarding rules in Office 365, file, more commonly with the cloud applications, the ability to file share outside your organization is something that's extremely common too. And then just monitoring for large changes in data volumes, right? Going outside your network are good ways to be able to get a sense of maybe if that's going on or if it's happening. I ran a quick poll. What's your biggest concern with ransomware? And that, out of extortion, exfiltration, whether or not to pay the ransom or preventing ransomware, number one answer is preventing ransomware. Is the biggest concern, and then exfiltration being the second one. And then it looks like we have a vote for extortion. And I think one of the questions comes up here is like, hey, when and if should you make a payment when you get hit with ransomware? You have any advice on that one?
When it comes to paying on the ransom, most days I'm sitting in the camp of no, you really shouldn't, because you're, facilitating. And a lot of these groups now have been, again, at it for so long that they've accumulated so much, funding, like we've talked, many years about, the advanced persistent threats, being those groups that are run by governments, and have tons of funding and personnel, right? Well, a lot of these ransomware groups are now have enough funds that they're at that level, right? So like by you paying into that, you're facilitating, the continued growth of that market. So yeah, I think in most cases it should not be considered, both from that perspective, and the other thing that kind of makes it dicey is, the insurance industry, right? Like that's been another big part of the ransomware thing, is a lot of payments have been facilitated by insurance providers, which with the rate of explosion of, ransomware attacks, a lot of those premiums are seeing like a, 50 to 100% year over year, premium increase. So like that's not going to be sustainable for a lot of companies.
Yeah, I kind of hope in some regards that some of the regulations coming down prevents insurance companies from making payments. Because although logical, right, of like, oh, it's just cheaper to pay the payment than to do, it actually doesn't help drive towards solving the problem. And yeah, I think that's somewhat aspect of reality. I do look at how accessible cryptocurrency is becoming nowadays too, and it's like it is making it much easier to be successful. And that might drive payment costs down as well. I don't know, supply and demand maybe. And I'm sure that there'll be new techniques these groups take or different approaches. But yeah, the idea is to really raise that bar and make it harder for them to actually gain access to money. Cool. So that was kind of overview on the, hey, discovery, gain a foothold, escalate privileged access, execute files, exfiltrate data. I think like some of the advice of like, yeah, making sure that you harden shut down ports on firewall that shouldn't be open, updating your devices, and especially anything that's internet accessible, enabling two-factor, and then monitoring for when these different techniques or tactics are used is a pretty big portion of prevention when we're talking about ransomware. Because the reality is like, I think a lot of people focus on how do I contain ransomware, but they don't actually spend a lot of the time on like, how do I actually prevent it? And the prevention doesn't, doesn't necessarily tie directly to the deployment of it itself, which is a lot of things that people overlook when they're considering how to approach this, right? So on the Blumira side, right, like we help in each of these different areas. I'm not going to go into great detail, but help to with techniques and tactics of getting visibility from a discovery perspective, watching for the different things like password spraying, RDP connections, and how to get a foothold. And on down the stack all the way to the point of auditing when new domain account administrators are created. So I'm gonna what that enables you to do is respond much earlier, right? In a matter of minutes to hours of the initial tactics people are using. And a lot of times even blocking them automatically in the instance of like password spraying for remote access, which I'll show here in a second. So I'm gonna hop over and just show a few examples. We have a few minutes left, and also want to open it up for Q&A and comments as we're going along that you can ask Brian about while I'm doing this. So try not to take too much time, but yeah, some of the key things. Just to scroll down in examples, if we're looking at different tactics used and things we detect, like honeypot access, like that's a pretty good example of internal recon scanning, right? You want to talk a little bit about how honeypot works, so everyone knows?
Yeah. So honeypots have, they've been used in the industry for a while now, and some of their very early usage was, much more kind of like a research, let's throw this on the internet, see what people do with it kind of a thing. That's not what we're talking about here. The honeypots that we're looking for would be deployed inside your network, and they're looking for behavior that you should not see within your network. So, the honeypot will act, as a fake file share or fake FTP server, and people within your environment know that it's not real, right? But someone coming in from the outside, if they try and authenticate to it, over SMB or over FTP, or they, hit the web page and try and log in through the web portal, those are very high, fidelity indicators that someone's poking where they shouldn't be. So it gives you very good signal to noise ratio when it comes to, detecting that type of internal reconnaissance.
Now on the Blumira side, right, in product, what we do is, in addition to discovery and surfacing this, provide analysis and then make recommendations on what to do from an actions perspective. As far as like, blocking, for example, and in some cases where we can integrate automation, next gen firewall is a good example of a good commonly used tactic like password spraying, where we can correlate and detect both password spraying as well as, hey, in this instance, this example doesn't say it, but maybe the IP addresses are on a bad threat feed. And what this allows you to do is then essentially take action by blocking the IP of the attack on your firewall. And we do this not only with the capability to do that yourself, but you can actually automate that. So it automatically blocks. And I was going to just configure and show the automation. Let me just refresh this loading. But that essentially on the block list would allow you to configure to automate the response without having to be have someone follow up with that ticket. So essentially you're blocking automatically without human interaction or intervention. And so, you know, at every stage of the attack, we have different detections and ingest based on what data sets a customer has. So there is good, strong, adequate coverage to stop and prevent much earlier on. And one thing I would say there is, like, time and time again, especially working with a lot of customers, like the Exchange vulnerability, I think, is a great one and a good example where, you know, having these indicators of compromise were able to help customers that didn't patch early on to realize, like, hey, yeah, they actually are getting access to these applications and services and trying to move laterally. Is a good, you know, good demonstration of how that works. And then I would just say, from like the Exchange vulnerability, our response is the fact that, like, we're really one of the first people notifying customers that they were impacted or affected, and then getting indicators of compromise in our system for as soon as they were available to stop these attacks. But the reality is the, you know, the attackers that still did gain a foothold out of the Exchange server, they were using Cobalt Strike, and Mimikatz and other tools in order to get access laterally. So pretty interesting techniques and tactics used in that attack, for example. So, all right, that's as much on my show of the product. Anything else you want to add, Brian, as far as thoughts and recommendations on prevention of ransomware?
Yeah, no, I would reiterate the same, you know, thing there, is that, you know, as you showed through the, you know, what we would call the intrusion chain there, you have like 5 or 6 different key points that these actors are going to need to take before they can execute that ransomware. So each of those are those different breakpoints where you can, you know, break the chain, you know, cut that string and keep them from getting to that final objective. So definitely when it comes to, you know, the whole idea of preventing ransomware, yeah, definitely we're not focusing on, you know, oh, I want my AV to eat the ransomware executable, because if they're dropping the ransomware executable, you know, they probably have turned off your AV because they're domain admin at this point. So catching them as they escalate to that point is, again, definitely the key to preventing the ransomware.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. I didn't realize. So what you're saying is not only getting domain admin to deploy ransomware down to the accounts, but also to
disable all your security tools.
Yeah, no,
that's
I think I mean, that makes a little bit more sense on the detection side, because I think, like, yeah, one of the things we even monitor for is deleting security logs, right? So it's interesting to hear on the disabling AV side is a common tactic, so then they can get the ransomware itself deployed, which makes a lot of sense. So sweet. Hey, this has been fun. If there's any other questions, we'll stay on for a few more minutes here, and then I did throw up a poll if anybody wants to talk to us more about how we can help from a monitoring, detection, response perspective. So hey, we could talk about crypto. No, you talked a little bit about legislation. So you said you know, what do you see coming down as far as like regulation? You said likely more regulation around who is able to onboard into cryptocurrency. Is that right, at the exchange level?
Yeah, I don't know so much about the onboarding, but requiring the exchanges themselves to be able to identify the customers, right? So like that's one part of it from and not necessarily that it would necessarily need to involve that much more actual like legislation itself, more as you're probably talking rules changes there to require existing laws to, extend these exchanges as opposed to brand new legislation. So you're probably talking more rules changes on that side of things. And a lot of the focus too. So there was a ransomware task force that was put together, and a lot of their recommendations, go down to a lot of working with like partners and allies, right? Because ransomware is a transnational crime, and that's one of the other big issues with tackling it has been a lot of the actors. The reason they're able to operate besides, cryptocurrency is because they're in jurisdictions that historically
don't hold them accountable.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
It's one of those things where it's not going to be any one silver bullet, but if we can get a lot of these different initiatives going at the same time, each of them makes it harder for the adversary. And I know from both from the detection standpoint, but also just from the general ecosystem, and environmental landscape. The idea is you want to increase the cost on the adversary, right? If you make it too costly for them to do what they need to do, then they're going to be disincentivized from it. So whether that's from you're able to detect and catch them, to you're able to prosecute them, to they can't get the money out of the exchange because it all got seized, all of these things make that much harder for the adversary, right?
Yeah. It's kind of interesting, even before cryptocurrency, right? Working with some of the large financials, there was clear extortion going on that they let happen because of the cost to prevent it in unset agreements. Now, I don't think that's going on nowadays anymore. I could be wrong. But yeah, I was shocked sometimes in working with these financials to hear oh, we have a set amount allowed to be transferred on the Swift network to these addresses. It's not much different than what was happening on before. I think it was happening more on a financial services level though.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically were saying, yeah, that's a cost of doing business we're okay with. And I was kind of surprised, hearing, I was like, wow, you're making payments to these organizations, which are not, you're talking about nation states and other things like that. But now it's becoming normalized to every organization and business is impacted and affected by that risk. And at scale, it's people need to stop paying, need to get the right prevention and detection matters in place and go from there. So, well, we're a little bit over time, but it's been fun, Brian, talking about ransomware, your experiences, stages within an attack, and how to prevent that. Thanks for the time today.
Thank you for having me join you.